Hello to all you new MVP mentors. My name is Graham Goulden. I'll introduce my background shortly, but first of all, thank you for inviting me to participate in this MVP virtual summit. You know, here in Scotland, where I'm from, a few thousand miles across the Atlantic is where I live, just south of the capital city of Scotland, Edinburgh. I live in a lovely village called West Linton, right outside right out in the country. A lovely place to live. And you're in Iowa. And I've been to Iowa quite a few times to work with colleagues at the University of Northern Iowa. I've trained a number of mentors over the last few years and supported my colleagues. So it's a pleasure to be asked to participate and deliver a keynote talk to you today as part of your MVP training, your Mentors in Violence Prevention training. My plan shortly is to share my screen and go through some slides and talk about, first of all, my background, but then start to think about, giving you a message about, what's inside my head around many different issues and how I'm thinking differently around issues of abuse and violence in society. So I'm going to share my screen just now with you, and I'm hoping that this is all going to work for us all today. My focus is on this new lens. I want us all today, you've signed up to be mentors within the MVP program, the Mentors in Violence Prevention program. And I'll talk about my involvement in that program as we go through this talk. I want us to start looking at things a lot differently. My background is policing. I spent 30 years as a Scottish police officer. I don't know if you can spot the fresh-faced 19-year-old boy. I often say I was a boy when I joined the police service back in 1987. And all I wanted to do was to enforce the law, was to go out and catch the people who broke the law. And I never thought there was any other role for me in policing. And over the years in policing, I became very good at that. I was a detective for many years. One of these individuals really inspired to go out and respond to calls from the public, deal with their issues, and where offenders were present, detect them, arrest them, and put them in front of a court. And that's something I really thought that was my job. And when it comes to violence, I thought probably, for the bulk of my policing career, that the only way to respond to violence was through policing. And now I've really started to think a lot differently around these issues. In many ways, if your only tool is the hammer, i.e. policing, then you'll start to look at all the problems as nails. And I think we need to be thinking a lot differently around issues of violence and abuse, especially if we want to prevent it for the long term. I was often involved in prevention work for the short term. That's what I came to realize in the police service. My actions were really just short term. People are caught, they're apprehended, they're arrested, they're sentenced in court, some would go to jail, but eventually they would get back out again. And we were just having that revolving door of issues. So back in 2009, I was forced to think differently. And at that time, I was promoted to Chief Inspector within the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit. And I don't know if some of you may have seen the film Dead Poets Society. It's an old film now, and if you haven't seen it, go and watch it. It's a real fantastic film about coaching, about mentoring, about life. And there's one of the scenes in the film where Robin Williams' character stands on the desk in the classroom and says, I stand on my desk to remind myself that we must constantly look at things in a different way. And I suppose in those last 10 years of my policing, I was forced to think differently. The Violence Reduction Unit in Scotland has been looked at around the world as a model of success. We look at violence as a disease. So we're thinking differently already. And diseases can be tackled. Look at the COVID pandemic just now. Public health is tackling the COVID pandemic, and public health can tackle violence and abuse in society. And that's me thinking differently, taking my police hat off. Well, I want to tell you a little story of something that happened to me about 2 years before I retired from policing. I got to retire from policing in 2017, and I still am very much involved in the delivery of violence prevention training, not only in the UK, but often in the United States and sometimes in Europe as well. And back, I think it was in 2016, I was, and I've got some pictures here, I was in my little red car. This is an exact replica of the car that I was driving at the time, a funky Renault Clio. I was driving that car, and I was stopped at a set of traffic lights. Actually, I was stopped near to a football ground. This is quite a bad soccer team in Scotland, Hibernian, and I'd just been speaking at a conference at this event. So I was in my car, stopped at the traffic lights, and I saw a man called John. Not Die Hard John, but I've just used that for effect. And John was standing at the traffic lights, and John looked a bit older at the time, and I was taken right back to my policing career because I recognised who John was. And John looked, John was a person that I had known back in the late 1980s. I had, as a police officer, I had probably, he was an offender, he was breaking the law. And John was, when I first met John, he was 15, 16 years old. And I remember, and by the way, at this time in my car, John looked about 10 years older than me. He just looked, and there's an old John as well in the picture there. But I started to think about my policing career back in the late 80s, early 1990s, where I would hound John. I would, if he was breaking the law, I'd be the first at his door to arrest this person. I knew that his dad had been a victim of murder. His dad had been killed through violence. I knew that his mum was an alcoholic and wasn't very much in John's life at the time. John was being looked after by his grandmother, who was really not coping with John. And in many ways, John was just fighting back. And I didn't, despite knowing all these issues, I didn't connect what was going on in John's life, what had been going on. And I was aware that his mother had been a victim of domestic abuse, domestic violence perpetrated by his father, right through John's early years, right up till the time when John's dad was killed, quite close to John's house. And despite knowing all this stuff, I didn't really make the connections. And I felt really bad because I looked at John, he looked at me, we didn't recognize each other. Well, sorry, he didn't recognize me, I recognized him. And I felt quite ashamed. And why I felt ashamed, because I've been part of his life at 15, 16, 17. I was probably the one that meant that he's got a criminal record. I know he committed crimes and needed to be held accountable for what he did, but I didn't really think about speaking to John at the time about these issues and what he was going through, because I didn't know about it. But I know about it now. I knew about it when I saw John at those traffic lights parked up in my red car, and it was that lightning bolt moment that you have in your life where you realize that I'm glad that I'm now thinking differently. Imagine what I would have been like if I'd gone back to the late 1980s with the knowledge that I have now on these issues. And a lot of my work just now is trying to get police officers to think differently about the people they are coming across, because the vast majority of people that police officers respond to, deal with in the street as victims, as perpetrators of violence, are often people who have gone through quite traumatic events as young children. The science of adverse childhood experiences. There was a study done in San Diego in your part of the world in the mid-1990s, which looked at the impact of childhood adversity and how the impact of childhood adversity, how that can lead to changes in a person's biology. It doesn't always happen, and I'll talk about that shortly, but we know that exposure and some of the ACEs that came out from this study, we talked about being a victim of physical abuse, being a victim of neglect, emotional abuse, being a victim of sexual abuse, household dysfunction, mental illness in the family, incarcerated relatives, domestic abuse. There'll never be peace in our streets until we have peace in the home. There'll never be peace in the world until we have peace in the home. And all of these adverse childhood experiences were impacting on John. I look at these and I look back at John's life, and John ticked off the boxes. And the science says that the more of these ACEs that you have in your adverse childhood experiences you have in your life, there's challenges. There'll be challenges for you in the future. But I want to caveat that a little bit. I want to make it clear that just because you have 4, 5, or 6 aces in your life doesn't mean you will always have issues as adults. The science says that with all these aces, if you have that one buffer, that one individual, and that could be a member of the extended family, that could be a good friend, that could be a police officer in society, a teacher even, a mentor, I would suspect would fall into that. If you have that consistent person in your life, that can counter some of the effects of the trauma. And this trauma that we talk about, and I wasn't aware of this in my early years in the police service. It was only when I joined the violence reduction unit that I started to think about things differently. And the circle of violence, the cycle of violence that we often talk about, and a lot of it starts in childhood. And we can change, we can make things better and different with our intervention, with our thinking. And we need to do it, because adverse childhood experiences can lead to a number of issues, including early death. When we look at issues in society around suicide, around homelessness, around drug addiction, alcohol addiction, if you look at the backstory to a lot of the individuals that are coping with these issues, the backstory is often rooted in trauma. So we all need to have a new lens when it comes to these issues. This is, my new lens looks at trauma, looking at the issues differently in society, trying to understand things a lot differently from when I was a police officer. And I would urge all of you to start thinking differently. Don't be too quick to judge that homeless person you see in the street. By the way, maybe even call them people without homes. I sometimes think that, homeless person, we forget that the person is actually an individual. And often behind that individual, there'll be trauma, there'll be issues that person is dealing with. And for me, the counterbalance for trauma, in my view now, is good relationships. And when you start to work with young people in your schools, in your community, in your school communities and wider communities, the relationships that you will start to build in your schools will help in some ways provide that buffer for that young person who may be going through issues in their life. And we know that in some settings, by 10 o'clock in the morning, some young people have lived a whole life because of issues that have been taking place in their own houses, in their own homes. And you have a role to be part of that individual's life, to support them in their school community. So we all need to think differently. I've gone from being a police officer who thought the only way to deal with situations was to enforce the law. And we need to do that. People still need to be held accountable for what they do. But we also need to try and respond in a way that will help the individual change their path, change their direction. My new lens, involves my daughters. These are my 2 girls, Jennifer and Alice. And the reason I show their picture is because when we start to look at the MVP program, we start to look at the impact of violence and abuse in society. And does it affect, who does it affect in our wider circle of friends or family? Both my girls have been victims of some men's abuse. And when you start to do more work around violence and abuse using the MVP program, I'm not just talking about the physical side of abuse. We talk about the verbal, we talk about the emotional as well. So we'll start to look at it. And I started to speak to my girls about their experiences of some men's behaviour. And they really started to change my view and started to think, as a man, I have a responsibility, not just to not commit abuse, but to speak up, to challenge behaviours. So thinking differently as a man. I remember Jackson Katz, who created the MVP program, saying to me, saying to me back in 2010 when I first met Jackson, he said, "Graham, as a man in Scotland, what are you doing about preventing violence and abuse?" Nobody had actually ever spoken to me like that before. He made me think differently. He made me think about the experiences of my daughters, my wife, my brother, my extended family, my friends. I'd never really thought about my responsibility. When you look at violence around the world, the vast majority of violence is committed by some men. The vast majority of victims of men's violence are other men. When you start to look at domestic violence and sexual violence, Girls and women make up the most at-risk group of being victims. Men and boys are victims too, and that's wrong, and we need to address that. But this is me, you know, how I'm speaking just now was not how I spoke 15, 16 years ago. And it's only by meeting people like Jackson Katz, like Dr. Alan Heisterkamp, who was one of your organisers of this event, and other inspiring people who've made me think differently. So I would urge all of you to start to think a lot differently in the issues. Another area that I am really passionate about is supporting boys and men in society. Now, this great TED talk by Dr. Philip Zimbardo, the US psychologist, The Demise of Guys. And for the young men watching this, don't think that, oh, we're here, Graham's having a go at boys and men. I'm not doing that. But when you look around the world, our young men are struggling. That's the fact. So we need to start thinking about how we can support our boys. Our boys are struggling in relationships, in academics, and sexually as well. And we need to start thinking differently and start asking why around these issues. I started to look at chimneys. No. You probably think, what the hell's going on with this image here? But when I saw this image about a year ago, this is what I saw. I saw a victim, and victims need to be supported by the system, but victims need to be supported by you as well. Perpetrators of violence and abuse need to be held accountable by the system, but also by you as friends, as teammates, as classmates. And this third chimney is the bystander. And that's you, that's all of us in society. And I think we need to start supporting that third chimney, that bystander, in a better way and bring them into the conversation. And what you'll start to do with the MVP program is you will start to bring young people in your school into the conversation as the bystander. Because I think just now the bystander is seen as the co-conspirator, as part of the problem. And I know that in your schools, just like schools in Scotland, that friends are seeing situations, are watching their friends being bullied, harassed, abused. They see it, they know there's a problem, but they just don't know what to do. They don't want to stand out from the crowd. And what you can start to do through the excellent work, the excellent program that is MVP, is you're going to start to support individuals to be the best friends, the best classmates, the best teammates that they can ever be, the best friends they want to be. And you know what? The best friends that we need them to be as well. So think differently. I've started to think differently around lots of issues. You know, bringing in the bystander is probably one of the big things that I'm passionate about doing just now. How do we bring that person into the conversation? Got to think differently. So your MVP journey is just starting. My MVP journey started back in 2010 when I first met Jackson Katz, and I started to develop MVP Scotland. You know, just like in the UK, I'm sure that young people in your schools are facing a number of challenges. COVID-19 is a big challenge just now for everybody. Poor mental health, you know, Generation Z, that's the generation that you are part of, and young people are part of just now. You are the activist generation. In America, you are going out and saving the planet. You are addressing gun control in America. But just like here in the UK, your generation is struggling with mental health. And I can only see that getting worse because of the ongoing COVID crisis. Other challenges, you know, messages, harmful, toxic messages around masculinity on social media. Social media isn't the problem, but it's the relationships that are being formed on social media that are. Young people are being exposed to some really unhealthy, toxic messages. And as I said, you are the activist generation. You are going out doing all these wonderful things, but we also know that the challenges that you're facing in your relationships, not only with yourself, but with other people, are leading to a number of negative impacts for you as individuals. And I think it's important that when you're growing up in your different communities, you're seeing so many different things and you're asking yourself so many questions. Should I get involved in situations? That's wrong. But if I don't do something and help out, what am I saying about that? About what I've just seen, what's going on with my friends? And I think another thing to think about with MVP is that if we start to build relationships, healthy relationships, we can support our young people not only be the best friends they can be, but the best individuals they can be. You and the work that you're doing with MVP are going to be supporting your communities in many different ways. You're going to be supporting your community to reduce violence and abuse in your community and society. But in schools, if we get relationships right, learning goes up. If we get relationships right in society, violence and abuse comes down. So your job, your role as an MVP mentor is to build relationships. As I said, social media in itself isn't the problem, but it's the relationships that our young people are getting involved in. Peer pressure, peer influence, that desire to fit in. We've all been there. Some of us will still have challenges around that need to be part of the team, to be part of the group. And sometimes we can do things that are completely contrary to our values, our beliefs, our attitudes. So you, as a mentor, that's what you are. You are the mentor in the Mentors in Violence Prevention program. In Scotland, we have many hundreds, indeed thousands of young people going through mentoring here in Scotland. And I've started some MVP projects elsewhere in the UK. And you're just giving people the hand, a helping hand that we all need. Remember, we talked about at the very start the counterbalance to trauma and challenges in life, which is a helping hand. It's not to solve people's problems, but just to be there, be that supportive ally, that supportive friend. So MVP is about you supporting people in your community. To say in Scotland, we have a whole range of inspirational young people who are doing remarkable things in their schools. They are providing an anti-violence narrative in school communities. Just now, the narrative in the media and communities around violence is that violence is the norm. You know what? Violence isn't the norm. Most people on this planet, abhor violence and abuse. They want it to stop. And what you're doing with MVP is you're giving the majority the voice. You're giving them the voice. You're giving them extra knowledge. You're challenging thinking. You're creating conversations. And in my view, conversations bring healthy norms to the surface. And lastly, you're inspiring leadership amongst young people. One day a generation will rule a population. I don't like that word rule, so let's replace that with lead. One day a generation will lead a population. In fact, you're already leading a population, a society. We have a number of schools who are starting to do MVP, so you're not alone in the work that you're doing. So if you're standing in front of a class in the future doing MVP sessions, we have many hundreds, many thousands of young people doing exactly the same this side of the Atlantic. So you are not alone. You're helping individuals step into that spotlight. We've all been there. We've all seen a problem. We all know it, that what we're seeing is wrong, but we don't know what our friends are thinking. As I said, the conversations that you're having with young people help them see that their friends, more often than not, think the same as each other. So that every individual here knows that people are thinking the same and that you have allies to get support from. For me, violence prevention is a passion. It's my why to make the invisible visible. There's things I know now that I didn't know 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And my passion is to try and help other people see these things. I don't force my viewpoint down individuals. I find ways of communicating it, ways of influencing people's behavior. I've met far too many people who just say, Graham, you need to do this. You need to think differently. I don't need to think differently. But I need to give people reasons to think differently. A few years ago, and just to finish off this talk, a few years ago, I visited a part of the world which in the early 1990s was subject to a civil war, which led to genocide. But bear in mind that after the Second World War, we said genocide, the Holocaust, would never happen again. In Bosnia-Herzegovina in the mid-1990s, at a place called Srebrenica, 8,372 boys and men over the age of 13 were summarily executed simply because they were of Muslim background. Now, genocide just doesn't happen. It's like fights, knife crime, gun crime, sexual assault, sexual violence just doesn't happen. It starts somewhere. It starts with words, it starts with language, it starts with a rhetoric. with a narrative. And that's where we need to be intervening in situations. And excuse me, MVP will give you the opportunity to work with young people to intervene as early as possible. I made this short film, a few seconds to watch this, just to give you a reason what my passion around prevention, because if we don't tackle the words and language in society, is it any wonder things will happen?
Some people think that I harp on a lot about what I do in my work. And maybe I'm speaking about it too much, but you know what, I'm going to keep harping on, because this is what happens when you don't. This is Srebrenica in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And who would have thought this could have happened? So I'm going to keep harping on, folks. I'm going to keep harping on.
I watched that film and I still get very emotional watching that film, simply because of what happened and how, you know, I remember watching on my TV screens as a young man, watching what was going on in Bosnia at the time, the former Yugoslavia. And it really, when I was there, seeing those gravestones and thinking to myself, we could have stopped that. Something could have been done to have stopped that, but no one did anything. Silence is violence. The standard you walk past is the standard you accept. And we need to have these conversations in our communities, in our schools, to help young people, if they see something that's problematic, not to walk away, to do something. And the MVP, you are going to be giving young people the skills, the tools, the strategies, the confidence to be leaders in your communities. One day a generation will lead a population. So thank you for your taking your time to watch this Scotsman talk today. I hope to come out to Iowa once we get through this horrible COVID pandemic. I wish you well at this time. I wish you good health and well-being and safety. And thank you for your leadership. Your leadership is key, not just at this time, but in the future. Have a great virtual summit. Thank you.